So both the United States remain trapped in the illusion that they still have hegemonic power, and Bolsonarism itself also makes this mistake. Because with Bolsonarism, it's very easy to see this. Well, not now, right? Now you saw Flávio groveling to Michelle. He said, no, for God's sake, I'll humble myself. What do you want? I'll humble myself and all that. I had said this would happen. Many people bet it wouldn't. No, it will happen because the balance of power is no longer the same. And Bolsonarism still believes they're back there in 2019, 2020, just before the pandemic, when Bolsonaro's power reached its peak. That's no longer the case. What you saw today with Flávio giving in is the real world result of that, man.
The United States government announced another tariff, 12.5% on top of the 25 that was already there, and on top of the 10%, which is that universal tariff. So we're already talking about 37.5% in tariffs. When a product from Brazil reaches the United States costing 37.5% more, you're practically making this trade unfeasible, right, man? Imagine shoes, a machine that's exported to the United States with a 37% increase for the buyer over there. It makes business between Brazil and the United States unfeasible, right? This new round of tariffs creates a situation where we really don't want to do business with you. We want to corner the Brazilian government more and more to show strength. I even see it as a show of strength, right? Yeah, there's no possible negotiation with the United States anymore. So it's that show of strength, not similar, but with the same goal as the show of strength in Cuba, which is to totally subjugate the country, leave the country in a terrible state to get what they want, to get the government removed, to achieve a change of government and put an ally in place. I see pretty much the same thing that the United States is doing to Brazil. Of course, allowing for the differences with Cuba, what's happening there is much more serious, but it's an intention to block, to put a wall in the way of negotiations between Brazil and the United States,
Yeah, but that would have been much more effective in the 60s, in the 80s, in that context of the Cold War, basically, a unipolar distribution of power. Mainly, and then for sure, in a definitive way, after the dismantling of the Soviet bloc in the early 1990s, and in which Uncle Sam called the shots unilaterally, literally. There wasn't any choice, they said what had to be done, and there were those who complied or those who were eliminated. Many times both things happened, Kissinger said that, right? There's the reasoning of Henry Kissinger, where he says, look, being an enemy of the United States is bad, but being an ally is deadly because they'll steamroll you with even more justification. So I absolutely agree with you. That's it. That's the idea. The idea is to focus. The idea is to exercise what he has come to call, which is also pathetic. He keeps putting his name on everything. He has a vision that's very much what in international relations we call realism. Who are people who only believe in the distribution of power, and that history is written solely and exclusively through power. And without a doubt, power is one of the fundamental dimensions, but there are countless others that these people disregard. And by disregarding this, Ricardo Mello, they are limited to the low ceiling that you usually have when you want to achieve things based on force. Do you understand? You actually can. Consider your life. That's why international relations is a beautiful field. Because to reflect on how international society works, on international relations and so on, you need to think about the human condition itself. So, is there anything you can achieve through force, through coercion? Sometimes yes, in very rare exceptions as I see it. Using a stronger measure was actually the right thing to do, but in 99 out of 100 cases, it's not, man. In 99% of cases, you need to consider that the other person is a complex, contradictory individual and that there are multiple approaches that can be used. It's the same in the concert of nations. But Trumpism and Bolsonarism only speak one language, which is this: you do what I'm telling you or I'll break you. It's no wonder that Bolsonarism tells everyone, you got elected because of my father, so your legislative seat has to be ours, because without us, you're nobody. That works, Ricardo Mello, as long as you maintain your dominant position. From the moment you don't have as much strength anymore, it would be much more effective and smarter to negotiate.
Right. Caesar, today the government, because of this tariff, announced once again that it will start the process of applying the reciprocity law. And then I keep thinking, right, because he's been talking to the sectors when he applied 25. The government talked to the sectors involved and they asked not to apply reciprocal measures at that time because it still wasn't possible. It could end up making business completely unfeasible because Trump could retaliate again, raise it to 7%, 100%. And the negotiation ended. Any possibility of business between Brazil and the United States was over. But with 37.5 as well, I don't see much difference from a situation where trade becomes unworkable. How do you see this issue? So, do you think it's important to hold back with this retaliation? Could it get worse if Brazil wants to retaliate against the United States? Or do you think we really have to go after them because we've already reached a limit that we can't accept anymore?
No, I think there's a paradox, Ricardo Mello, I understand. As a rule, especially on our side, people want to hear that, and it's actually a basic principle of international relations that you have to apply reciprocity. Like I told you, why does it work between nations? Because it works between people. Can you imagine if I call you 3 times and you never call me back? What am I going to think? That you don't want to talk to me, right? Am I going to call a 4th time? Maybe I would because I love you a lot, but I wouldn't make a 5th call. Why? There's no reciprocity. Now, in practice, it's a lot more complicated, especially when you're dealing with a hegemonic, aggressive, imperialist power like the United States. And the United States in the hands of that scoundrel, that notorious criminal, Donald Trump. So in practice, this theory will be different. I'm not saying that I approve or that, I'm just analyzing how it looks to me. It looks like, in fact, it's going to happen. In practice, the theory will be different. In practice, there will be a certain discourse. Lula will position himself maybe in a firmer way because that's the path even necessary to defend national sovereignty, and it offers a great political platform for the government, right? Because you can imagine that nothing unites a society, a community, or a group more than the threat of an external enemy. And now it's real, right? It's not manufactured to score political points or anything like that. There is a huge external threat, and the Lula government rightly has taken a stance to defend national sovereignty. And that's much more interesting for communicating with this centrist segment than cheap penal populism, which we talked about at the beginning of our conversation. So I don't think so, Ricardo Mello. I don't think the Lula government will go down this path of confrontation, of applying reciprocal tariffs. I think the government will act in a strategic way. And Itamaraty and the federal government will act accordingly, and so will the business sector. Okay? Because there are a lot of business interests involved. So there are 2 types of diplomacy. You have traditional diplomacy and what we call business diplomacy, which is what the brothers, for example, Josley, engage in. The guy gets a direct meeting with the president and says, meet with me. I supply 30 to 40% of the meat. If you want hamburgers tomorrow in the US, you need me. So it's an inexorable force, right? I think the government and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will adopt a specific type of strategy. They will hit where it hurts. They will try, for example, to use it as a weapon. That Brazil is a country that is fundamentally, unfortunately, actually fundamentally a supplier of primary products, meaning soybeans, iron ore, basic commodities, and to use the strength that Brazil has in this sense, looking toward China, signaling to other major players in the global south, as if to say, because there's no problem, we're not in 1960 anymore. There are alternatives. And the problem is that this can also trigger a more aggressive reaction from Trumpism. And who knows what could happen in the end. Ideally, Lula's government should establish what in 1945 Vargas established, more or less a kind of distance, what we call pragmatic equidistance. What does that mean? You just leave the guy alone, man. But if he talks to you, you also respond. You don't create an atmosphere of animosity or direct confrontation either. If he pushes too much, then you raise your voice a bit, you push back so the guy doesn't try to take over. That's the game of this pragmatic equidistance, because Flávio Bolsonaro would automatically align Brazil with the United States, just like Bolsonaro did, for example. In fact, in an even more subservient way than during the military period itself. Castelo Horaci Magalhães, maybe he was the only guy who said what's good for the United States is good for Brazil. But I think Bolsonarism was even more submissive, with all due respect to mutts, than the military themselves. So I don't think so. I think there will be a lot of strategy, a lot of caution, and the aggressiveness should be reserved for the rhetoric Ricardo Mello.
And China, by the way, has already winked at Brazil, right? They've already given that little wink saying, look, I'm interested in taking the product that the United States isn't buying, right? So in a way, Trump is actually pushing Brazil in the opposite direction of what he would like, which is toward China, right? And this, in the Western environment here, especially in South America, which is almost entirely dominated by the far right, this causes a lot of friction because everyone is aligned with the United States, right? And suddenly you have the largest nation in Latin America in terms of population and economy, this nation winking at the United States adversary. And so it's not possible that Trump didn't factor this in, right? I really want to understand this logic. Why? Because he knows this would happen, that Brazil would be pushed toward China, right? What was he expecting? That Brazil, even so, would turn a blind eye and not move toward China? Why? Because of pressure from the United States? Is that what he was expecting, do you think?
No, great question, by the way, on your part. I don't think so. I think Trump is a mercenary who uses and has always used the presidency of the United States to make billions, to make money, man. It's basic. The guy is there for the money. When he talks, man, the guy already has billions and he still wants more. Yeah. Yeah. The guy, damn, he sees himself as a predator, man. By the way, there's a Howard Stern show, man, that I'll show you later, man. Howard Stern is a very famous radio host in the United States, and the guys start talking about sexual predators, and someone says to him, you know about that, right, Trump? And Ivanka is right next to him. He feels flattered. Anyone else would say, can you imagine me saying that to you, man? You'd say, are you crazy, man? What do you mean, man? Did he go crazy? He turns around and says, yeah. Me? Exactly. So, like, he has this mentality that he's a killer, that he's a predator. He's a predator who's always been in the construction business. His father was the tycoon of that business. We know, everyone saw it by now. Roy Cohn, who was the lawyer, had this mentality of never admit anything. Attack. So he has, I don't think, look, that Trump is among the top American strategists, okay? Of diplomacy, of geopolitical decisions. I really don't think so. I think he surrounds himself with a bunch of sycophants. We saw that with Pete Hegseth. We saw that with basically his entire cabinet. He appoints his friends, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, Hitchcock. We pay money. It's a whole scheme. You know, Ricardo Mello.